This week we're talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality is the study of the way that our different identities interact with each other. So each of us is more than one thing. We have more than one identity. We have a sex identity, whether we're male, female, non-binary. We have a race identity. We have a religious identity. We have a class identity, whether we're rich or poor. But we're not each of those things one at a time. We're all of those things simultaneously. And those affect each other in important ways. And intersectionality is the way we think about that. So what is identity? How are we different? So human beings are different in thousands of different ways. If we took two people and we looked closely, we could find all kinds of different things about them, both about how they look, about how their bodies are, about what they believe in, what they think, what groups they belong to. But some of these differences are socially constructed as particularly important, and some of them are unimportant. The most famous example of this is eye color, right? We could imagine a society where people are categorized by eye color. That's a real physical difference between people, and which we group them that way. But of course we don't. We consider eye color more or less trivial as a difference between people. But some social differences have been particularly important in affecting people's lives and our understanding of them, and we refer to these as either categories, identities, or classes. And you know what these are. The list is a little variable, but broadly speaking, race, wealth, sex, sexuality, age, religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender identity, disability, veteran status are some examples of ones that are particularly important and impactful in our society. Now, it's not that these are not differences at all, and some of them have some inherent effect on them, but the way we socially construct them makes them more important, makes the difference bigger than the actual difference. And for an example of this, let's talk about skin tone. Skin tone is a real physical difference between people. Some people have darker skin, some people have lighter skin. The cause of this is that some people have more melanin, and people with more melanin in their skin have darker skin. And this does actually have an impact on people. People with less melanin in their skin sunburn more easily. Melanin is there to protect the skin against the sun. And in terms of where people come from in the world, people who come from the nearer the equator, the hotter part of the world, tend to have darker skin. People that come from nearer the poles, the colder parts of the world, tend to have lighter skin. So there is some physical difference here that's biological, but obviously you all know that the way we understand skin tone in our society has far more socially constructed around it than just this fairly trivial observation that people with dark skin can go out in the sun longer without burning, right? We've added all of this meaning in the way we understand this difference, and we've made it a difference between people that has effects. So what is going on with identity? Identity is a word we use to kind of mean lots of different things at once. So one thing is self-identity, right? We talked about this with gender, but we can apply it to many other things. So we can think of identity just as how someone understands themselves, and then what they're interested in often is whether other people recognize that, and so they communicate that. So then we can understand identity as a type of conversation where the person is expressing their self-identity through a variety of signs, how they act, how they talk about themselves, and so forth. And then other people's society is interpreting everyone else's identity through these signs, and obviously that communication process is imperfect, but we can understand that as what's going on. We can also think of identity from the point of view of sociologists, of studying society and classifying people from the outside. So this might not be the same as their self-identity. So for example, we talked about this last week, some sociologists have done studies into men that have sex with men, and some of those men identify as homosexual or bisexual, some of those men identify as straight. So their self-identity is different, overlapping, but different from the way that we might classify them when we're studying their behavior, when we're interested in how they work in society. Right? And when we're interested in looking at power in society and power relationships, we find ways to classify people so we can do that analysis. And we're engaged in this group project with identity. What I mean by that is we notice things about ourselves, properties about ourselves, and then we look for other people that have similar properties that are important to them, and we look at how they describe themselves, and that's how we join an identity, right? So we might have some experiences of gender that we notice are not typical. We then look for other people who describe themselves as having the same experiences of gender. We look at what they call themselves, maybe they call themselves MBs, right? And then we think, oh, I'm like them, so we take on the same identity term. And whether we get accepted into the group or not is important to us. But then also groups splinter, right? So we'll have a group of people with the same identity, and some people in that group will look at the group as a whole and say, there's something about us that isn't the same as everyone else in this group in an important way. We're going to come up with a new term and identify ourselves differently. So it's a social project how identities are socially constructed. Identities may be known or unknown. So some people have a self-identity that is the same and are aware of their identity. Other people might not be aware that they have an identity, but it's still important in terms of how they act in society. One example of this is social class. A lot of Americans believe that they are middle class. It's a very large group of Americans who self-identify as middle class. But if you look at their income, if you look at their wealth as a way of understanding their economic class, there's actually a lot of Americans that are working class who are, in the lower 30% of income of wealth in society, and who have just kind of been tricked into thinking that they're better off than they are, because that's part of the ideology here. So when we study people, we might look at identities that they don't know or accept that they have in understanding them. Another example of this, if you look on the census, there's some number of white people who, when asked their race, do not describe it as white, describe it as American. And they're quite passionate about this. They believe that they are Americans and that's their racial group. But, if you study them, they are in fact white people and act like white people in various ways, right? And so when we're studying identity, we don't necessarily go by people's self-identity or go by the identity that people have. Overall here, identity is complex, but we all have a lot of them. We can move between them as our lives go on, or some of them stay the same. But that's the basis of understanding what we're talking about in intersectionality, is this idea of having many identities.